virtual background.
Oh, it's just one of the virtual ones. Okay, thank you so much.
I tried to do it, but it slowed my camera down, so I'm scared to put it back.
So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the afternoon session. This session is entitled Black Lives Matter and Environmental Justice. My name is Dr. Adrienne Hollis. I'm the Vice President, Environmental Justice, Climate and Community Revitalization and Conservation at the National Wildlife Federation, and I'm the moderator for this session. I've worked in partnership with environmental justice communities and organizations for more than 20 years, so this topic is definitely near to my heart. Long before Mr. Freddie Gray, or Mr. George Floyd, or Mr. Ahmaud Arbery, or Ms. Breonna Taylor were murdered, Black people have suffered from a number of extreme inequities because they were Black, because of redlining and racial profiling, and because they were the wrong complexion for protection. Today, we're going to hear from experts on a number of environmental justice issues, pointing out the fact that Black lives do indeed matter. In this session, authors from the special issue on the Black Lives Matter movement in the Journal of Environmental Justice will reframe the topics of Black Lives Matter and anti-Black racism through the lens of environmental justice theory, methods, and politics. They'll discuss their work, which includes dual impacts of police brutality and toxic prisons, the role of social workers in engaging Black communities in the fight against systemic environmental racism, and the military as a potentially significant contributor to environmental injustice. I am honored to introduce you to all of the fantastic panelists for this session in the order of their presentations. And for a more extensive biographical information on each, I would like to direct you to the bios link on the 2022 symposium page. Our first presenter will be Dr. Camila Alvarez. She's an assistant professor of sociology and faculty affiliate of public health at the University of California, Merced. She specializes in air pollution, social inequalities, environmental justice, and quantitative methodology. Her research focuses on how environmental problems manifest as a result of social and systemic inequities. The title of Dr. Alvarez's talk is Military as an Institution and Militarization as a Process, Theorizing the U.S. Military and Environmental Justice. Next, we have Dr. Benika Dixon. Dr. Dixon is an assistant professor at Texas A&M University School of Public Health and an Accountability, Climate Equity, and Scholarship Fellow. Her research focuses on understanding the physical and mental health impacts of environmental exposures and hazards, particularly among environmental justice communities and vulnerable populations, including incarcerated persons. Dr. Dixon's research integrates scholarship in epidemiology, environmental health, hazard and disaster research, and community engagement. The title of Dr. Dixon's talk is No Justice, No Resilience, Police, Prisons, and Disasters. Next, we have Dr. Eric Morrell. Dr. Morrell is an environmental justice practitioner and assistant professor of sociology at St. Lawrence University. She specializes in community engagement and critical theory in addressing inequality and social change among distinct geopolitical spaces. The title of Dr. Morrell's presentation is Spatialized Intersectionality, Gendered and Racialized Residential Segregation and the Milwaukee Lead Crisis. And last but not least, we have Dr. Lengefeld. Dr. Lengefeld's research intersects with his work with community organizations such as the Food Recovery Network and the Goucher Prison Education Project. Professor Lengefeld teaches courses in sociology and environmental studies with a focus on social and environmental transformation. His research examines the dynamics of violence, development, and environmental justice. The title of his presentation is Callous Cruelty and Blowback, ICE Facilities, Riskscapes, and Community Transmission of COVID-19. Each speaker will have approximately 15 minutes for their presentations, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for questions. So let's begin with Dr. Alvarez, please.
Everyone can hear me and the slide is showing, so we're off to a good start. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here with such a generous lineup of scholars and practitioners. So today I am going to be talking about a paper I collaborated with two other co-authors, and here in this session, I'm going to be talking about how we can think about the U.S. military within an environmental justice context. And before I get started, I do just want to acknowledge my two collaborators on this project, Nicholas Tice at the University of Oregon and Daniel Straub at the Brooklyn College. For this presentation, I want to outline three different dimensions that we're sort of looking at while we're thinking about the military and environmental justice. And we sort of outline these dimensions as like looking at the military as an institution, looking at the militarization as a process, and then we introduce this idea of applying a domestic approach to risk transfer militarism in order to understand military as an institution and militarization as a process. So to begin with the military as an institution, I'm a trained sociologist. And so, in sociology, we often say that we focus on social structures and not specific individuals. So this is an example of this is like in sociology, we focus on like structural racism, and we don't really focus on like a specific white person or specific Black person or specific Latinx person. We're trying to look at more macro level policies and how do they get reinforced within like policies, within culture, within those sorts of things. And social structures can be formal, like the Department of Defense, or they can be informal, like a group of defense elites. These social structures carry power to influence social processes and can create social inequities. And sometimes we refer to social structures as institutional actors. The military is a powerful and often overlooked institutional actor within our society. It is a large infrastructure in terms of the number of workers it has. I believe it's about like 2.3 million people work within the military in either civilian personnel, military personnel, and such. They are in control of a huge amount of land, not just within the United States, but around the world. And of course, they have an access to a large pot of financial resources. And so when we're thinking about it as a structure, it carries power to affect social problems, including environmental justice issues. And so in terms of theorizing this, we draw a lot on the sociology of race and ethnicity, in particular because sociology of race and ethnicity has really highlighted how it's important to be looking at state-sanctioned violence, so violence that happens through the state and is justified through the state. And we can think about the U.S. military as part of the empire or the racial state that colonizes and imperializes lands and people. And so we draw upon this sort of work. I don't have time to cover all of this, but you could refer to this in the future if you're curious for more. But before I move on, I just want to say one more thing within this approach, we're not arguing that like the state operates within a vacuum or even that the military operates within a vacuum, that it is also operating with other structural actors, including capital or capitalism. Let's see. So next slide, please. Oh, oops, I'm supposed to be changing slides. My bad. So next is looking at the history of the military within and its history of creating environmental injustices. The treadmill of destruction, which has been outlined by Hooks and Smith, they outline military activity as contributing environmental contamination and health risks because of industrial and high energy equipment and technologies. And of course, this is driven because the military is operating within an empire state in a global arms and defense race, as well as expanding its geopolitical control. And so some examples of the environmental injustices that have happened because that are tied to the military is examples of nuclear colonialism, including abandoned uranium mines on Navajo lands, radiation contamination of Western Shoshone land in Nevada. There are also examples abroad of this happening, including Agent Orange in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And also, myself and also other scholars have also shown that there is environmental injustices happening when neighborhoods are close to military bases. This increases air pollution, this increases groundwater contamination. And so we can sort of see how the military as a structural actor has local and global environmental health consequences. And this is also reflected within the principles of environmental justice that were adopted in the 1991 First National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. In the 15th principle, which states that environmental justice opposes military occupation, repression, and exploitation of lands, peoples, and cultures and other life forms. And then so that's sort of the first dimension. The next sort of dimension that we talk about is militarization as a process. And so when we say militarization, what we mean is how do aspects of the military's logic, as well as their equipment and technology, sort of spill over into other civic institutions? And we're going to hear a lot about carceral geography in this panel, so I won't get too much into it, but I'll sort of just highlight some of the intersections that happen between militarization and the prison industrial complex, as well as the immigrant industrial complex. The military industrial complex is defined as the relationships between military elites with either corporate elites and other government officials to reinforce the military's mission and their own capital and political interests. And so this complex intersects with the prison and immigrant industrial complex. And the prison industrial complex sort of also represents a network of elites sort of using the rhetoric of crime reduction to serve economic interests through like prison construction, through prisoner labor. And then we see that the immigrant industrial complex is a network of elites also working to criminalize undocumented people through policies and institutions, as well as profiteering from all of this. And so Tanya Golash-Bozar outlines that the industrial complexes have three things in common. They all work to justify themselves through rhetoric of fear. They are working with a network of elites in various social institutions. And then third, that they justify themselves through rhetoric of otherization. And so it's important to note that the rhetoric of fear and the discourse of otherization is being fueled, is being supported by racialized rhetoric of the war on crime, the war on drugs, and the war on terror. And this has implications for social inequalities because it criminalizes Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color. There is some intersections of all of this happening in that there are examples of prisons being placed on closed military bases. There are also examples of immigrant detention centers being placed on active military bases. And how this is an environmental injustice issue is that military sites are some of the most contaminated sites in the world. And so placing criminalized individuals on these toxic sites have environmental injustice implications. Another example of this intersections is known as the green to blue pipeline. The green to blue pipeline was the transfer of equipment from the Department of Defense to domestic police departments. Between 2006 to 2013, almost $1.5 billion was in equipment was transferred to domestic police departments from the Department of Defense. And it was this was transferred at no cost. And so these equipments are then being used against social movement demonstrations, including Black Lives Matter protests. And these are having implications for activists as well as the ecosystems that they are involved in. And so this represents sort of the intersections of these different complexes that's happening. And then the final thing that we talk about to sort of give some language for understanding the military as an institution and militarization as a process is we talk about the domestic risk transfer of militarism. And so the risk transfer militarism outlines that armed conflict and warfare are increasingly being transferred from battlefields to civilian zones. So there's like this, it's kind of talking about what is the spillover effects of the military. And the way that risk transfer militarism has been talked about a lot is through the use of drones. So drones, remote drones are, protect the operator who's like, it's sometimes in the United States, and but however endangers civilians. And so we would argue that we can also apply this at the domestic case as well in order to understand what is happening with the environmental injustices with the green to blue pipeline, with the intersections of closed prisons with with prisons on closed military bases, as well as using military bases as part of immigrant detention centers. So I'll start closing up my presentation, but I think it is important to be looking at military as an institution, militarization as a process, because it has historically been involved with racial projects and producing environmental injustices. And I hope that I got you interested in the topic, but just one thing I do just want to close, because I know a lot of this is about like, what can we do? I will just say that the Department of Defense has not updated its environmental justice strategic plan since 1994. So I think that is just one thing we could ask the Department of Defense to do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alvarez. Great presentation, so much information. Let's hear from Dr. Dixon, please.
Thank you. And are you able to see my slides?
Yes.
Good. Thank you. I'm glad to be here today. And as Dr. Alvarez stated, I'm really excited to be here with so many great scholars and doing this work. We've had several conversations about all of our work and how it kind of ties together. So I'll go ahead and get started. My presentation today: No Justice, No Resilience, Police, Prisons, and Disasters. Disasters are becoming more frequent and destructive, and the consequences for incarcerated persons are growing increasingly visible. Simultaneously, scholars, individuals, and communities are grappling with police brutality and systemic anti-Black racism in the criminal legal system by engaging with the concept of abolition. Environmental justice and disaster scholars have found that the same trends of anti-Blackness in the carceral state apply to environmental harms as well. And the same populations that are targeted by the prison industrial complex, predominantly Black communities, are subjected to disproportionately high rates of environmental harm and disasters. So in this published article and this presentation, it can be further demonstrated that these issues are not disconnected, and argued that the abolition of the prison industrial complex would mitigate the impacts of disasters for incarcerated persons and their communities. So incarceration undermines individual and collective resilience needed to recover from disasters. And when we look at the carceral infrastructure, it facilitates disaster harm to incarcerated persons and their communities. Incarceration itself mirrors the harm and destruction that we see from disasters. The incarcerated persons are disproportionately, again, representative of the most marginalized communities, particularly racial and ethnic minorities, with Black individuals most excessively represented under carceral control. Another similarity that we see between imprisonment and disasters is the physiological and psychological impacts that take place. These impacts include PTSD among directly impacted individuals when we're talking about disasters, as well as the impact on their families, exacerbation of existing chronic diseases due to interruption of medical treatment or a lack of resources, which we both see in disasters and incarceration. We also see increases in infectious disease transmission, which may be due to the overcrowding of disaster shelters or prisons, as well as poor hygiene and sanitary conditions. So next, we're going to talk about the role of policing during disasters. Police are one type of first responder often involved in disasters. And in disasters and emergencies, police tend to function as paramilitary structures, which we heard from Dr. Alvarez. Their roles in disaster is to maintain order. They enforce evacuation orders, perform crowd and traffic control, protect property, mitigate looting and crime. One of the key issues with policing during disasters is their function depends on the thought that social breakdown and mass crimes occur post-disaster. However, research from disaster scholars has shown that this increase in violence and crime is not true. In fact, communities often demonstrate increase in social cohesion and resilience post-disaster. Role abandonment, abuse, and misconduct during disaster events have also occurred. Communities most likely to experience disasters are also those most likely to experience issues of abuse of power by police and law enforcement. Next, taking a look at prisons during disaster. As we know, prisons are enormous institutions that house hundreds to thousands of people, and they're often socially and geographically isolated. We see overcrowding, overcapacity in many of the prisons. There's a need for large amounts of land, and that led to prisons being built in a lot of rural areas. And often when little concern for the presence of environmental and technological hazards. So as Dr. Alvarez talked, prisons being built on former military bases. We also know there's a history of building correctional facilities on or near Superfund or toxic waste sites. And this has led to exposure to environmental hazards, such as toxic coal waste, radioactive waste, pesticides, insecticides. We know that chronic health conditions, including asthma and other respiratory illnesses, may be exacerbated by such issues as poor environmental ventilation, unsanitary conditions, and the geographic location of correctional facilities. And we'll get into this in a few slides later. In addition to this, incarcerated individuals are often trained as first responders and oftentimes serve as the only emergency personnel for many rural communities. So not allowing, so we'll get to the next slide. So we're going to talk just an example of how this played out in Hurricane Katrina. One of the most controversial issues concerning prisons and disasters is the consistent refusal of state governments to evacuate incarcerated people, even as surrounding community members are told to evacuate due to the presence of a hazard. So during Hurricane Katrina, more than 6,500 inmates at the Orleans Parish Prison were abandoned without access to water, food, or ventilation. Deputies left their posts, claiming they had no emergency training. In some cases, contaminated water rose up to chest level in the cell blocks. Not allowing for the evacuation and not having proper supplies for incarcerated people puts them in harm's way and compounding of the effects of the disaster. Time and time again, incarcerated people are treated as unworthy of protection. So one of the things that we talk about in this paper is looking at abolition as a form of hazard mitigation. And FEMA defines mitigation as the effort to reduce loss of life and property by lessening the impact of disasters. In order for mitigation to be effective, we need to take action now, before the next disaster, to reduce human and financial consequences later. And we also see abolition is defined by critical resistance as a political vision with the goal of eliminating imprisonment, policing, and surveillance, and creating lasting alternatives to punishment and imprisonment. So why abolition as hazard mitigation? So there are several reasons, but the first reason, many communities such as Black, Indigenous, and people of color, documented and undocumented immigrants, and people with mental illness have been systemically criminalized by police. So when we talk about using police during post-disaster situations, it does not create a sense of safety for many community members. Over $80 billion is spent on the prison industry each year, and over $15 billion on policing, numbers that are increasing despite decreases in the number of crimes being committed. And every dollar spent on mitigation saves $6 in damages and recovery. So defunding police and prisons would make more resources available for community safety initiatives, including hazard mitigation. So just to talk briefly about prisons and climate change. Recently, I published a article or report along with my colleague, Carly Purdom from Texas A&M's Hazard Reduction and Recovery Center. And for this report, we worked very closely with Texas Prison Community Advocates, or TPCA. And this report focuses on extreme temperatures and COVID-19 in Texas prisons. And if you know about the current temperatures in Texas, we've been in extreme heat wave for weeks and months. So just to give a little bit of background and quickly give a few minutes of our findings, Texas is one of at least 13 states in the US that does not have universal air conditioning in state prisons, and only 30% of Texas prison units are fully air conditioned. Temperatures inside units have been shown to regularly reach 110 degrees, and at least one unit is known to have topped over 149 degrees for internal temperatures. 10 of the deaths we've seen were due to the 2011 heat wave. So since 1998, there have been nearly 24 heat-related deaths documented. However, we do question this just because of some of the reporting practices known in the Texas prisons. 2018, there were significant changes that greatly impacted the policies around heat-related policies. But we also know that those heat-related policies have been greatly impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'll get into that a little further. And we know that extreme heat disproportionately impacts incarcerated people with medical or mental health vulnerabilities. And we also have to take into account the aging population in the prisons. So the methods for this, 309 surveys were distributed by TPCA to incarcerated people housed across 57 units between October 2018 and December of 2020. The surveys were completed by incarcerated individuals and mailed back to TPCA. Texas A&M faculty cleaned and analyzed the data, And the survey included questions related to several topics: experiences with heat-related illness, experiences with heat restrictions, knowledge of heat-related deaths, the provision of resources. So did they have access to water, ice, cups, access to and experiences with showers, access to respite areas, fans, and other infrastructure to help with cooling, work-related experiences with heat. So did they have a job that forced them to work in extreme heat conditions, accessibility and availability of cooling commissary items. And then we also looked at the ability to file grievances. And while I don't have time today to go through the full report, I'm sure that I can provide a link to the full report later. So at the time of the analysis, 3 participants had died, including 1 participant who died from COVID-19 and another from homicide. And although no survey questions explicitly mentioned COVID-19, incarcerated participants wrote in to describe how COVID-19 was complicating their experiences with heat and their experiences with heat mitigation policies. So to quickly go over some of the results, when we looked at extreme heat and health, incarcerated people are disproportionately vulnerable to health impacts of extreme temperatures. Again, because of higher rates of mental illness, chronic health condition, and an aging population. Chronic diseases and conditions are known factors for heat-related illness, hospitalization, and mortality. And then we also have individuals who may also be taking medications that are worsened by the impacts of heat. So we asked about prescription medications. Were they on medications that would increase them to heat vulnerability? And we had 56% of respondents said they were prescribed some medication that had increased to heat vulnerability. And Jen, here just a quote from one of the respondents: "I want to make you all aware of the inhumane living conditions we're living under. Temperatures and heat indices have been in the 90s and hundreds lately. I personally have type 2 diabetes, asthma, and high blood pressure, and I shouldn't have been assigned housing in this row, but they don't really care about inmates' health." When we looked at heat sensitivity restrictions, so were they actually receiving any heat restrictions? 60% of respondents said they hadn't received any official heat restrictions. And TDCJ does this by providing a score of heat sensitivity, and that determines if you're available for a cool bed or any other restrictions that may be provided, such as respite care. And high probability includes many of these conditions, such as heart disease, mental health disorders, etc., and age. Access to water and ice. This is the last one I'll go over. According to TDCJ policy, ice is to be distributed along with water to incarcerated people. And we asked, have you had access to ice? Have you had access to water? So 66% of respondents said they have not had access to ice. 89% did have access to water. We also asked about access to cups for the water. And many did not have access to cups, even though they had access to water. And when we talk about water, this is often large water coolers left in a unit with ice and water. And many respondents complained of unsafe water quality as well. So in conclusion, of course, TDCJ and others promise that harassment retaliation will not be an issue when providing grievances, although respondents did say they had issues or feared grievances. Incarcerated people in Texas prisons continue to suffer from exposure to extreme heat, and we know this isn't just in Texas. So adding air conditioning and climate control is a very important issue, but to enact true systemic change, a system-wide structural mitigation endeavor would be needed. And this really highlights the overall thought of this paper and our work for abolition as a hazard mitigation strategy. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Dixon, for the excellent presentation. I'd like to invite Dr. Morrell to share her knowledge with us.
Hello, all. I am very bright-faced right now because the thunderstorm's blowing through. So I hope that my connection stays well. it's just hitting right now. So very timely for the talk, but it's wonderful to be here. I wanted to just acknowledge my co-author and my collaborator in research for this project, Dalvery Blackwell, who's not here today, but is the executive director of the African American Breastfeeding Network in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And our research is in Milwaukee. A little about me, real briefly, is that I was born in rural New Hampshire, and I grew up I'm the daughter of a refugee, and my mom is from communist Hungary, and my entire family on that side was interned during the Holocaust. And originally, some of how I understood my spatial and geographic orientation was that I had safety in the United States and that I had access to clean air and rural space. And then as I grew up, I learned a lot more about inequality in the United States and was horrified to have realized that I thought it was this safe haven. That was somewhere my family had come, and that just by changing kind of cultural and political contexts, and certainly geographic contexts, power and privilege had completely shifted. And it's something I've been hyper aware of and kind of connected to my interest in learning about things, and then my kind of drive to do activism and community engaged work. So Dalvery and I have worked a lot with, officials in Milwaukee on this issue and other grassroots coalitions like the Coalition on Lead Elimination. And they're all people that I can't acknowledge all of them, but it's kind of integrated work. So I'm very lucky to do it and so thrilled to be here to talk about this. Intersectionality is a term I think more and more people are getting familiar with, but I kind of want to walk us into how I got into this project, because I think it sets up for some of the key points about this concept of spatialized intersectionality I'll be talking about. So when I got involved with research in graduate school, and now I'm an assistant professor, I was outside of Detroit. And at the time, it was the early 2000s, and there was kind of these dichotomous debates in the space of like food and agriculture in the United States. And there was this local food movement, slow food movement, you kind of see represented in the top corner here. And it was kind of over time becoming a white racialized kind of privileged space, vote with your dollars. It was kind of a luxury to be able to do that kind of advocacy. And there was this kind of counter movement. People were criticizing the whiteness in food. And there was this counter movement, kind of a food justice movement in the United States that started really, it has deep, deep roots and it was already there, but it made another kind of, iteration to speak to this kind of whiteness in food that was emerging. And that was kind of this food justice movement. There's been a lot of research and also community activism around this. And I was near Detroit. And so I started doing my field work in Detroit, looking at this kind of we tend to think of inequality in a kind of dichotomous way, or black and white way, if you will, with like white privilege and non-white racialized oppression. And so I was going into the space to understand these dynamics because, as I said, growing up, these issues were always forefront for me, but they were rooted in a global perspective. And I really wanted to understand US and local context around race. When I was there, however, I got kind of woken up to this gendered element in the food system I had fully missed, and most of the scholars doing research were also fully missing. And this had to do with first foods, which we would refer to as things like infant formulas, human milk, and the foods that humans eat for the first few years of life. And it's a very important part of our life, and it sets up the stage for a lot of our health throughout our life course. And this is not about one being better than the other, or any kind of like that kind of black and white thinking. It's about realizing that there's a whole food system that is dealing with fresh foods, that's dealing with highly processed, reconstituted foods, that's dealing with a lot of food security issues that are shaped by broader structural and cultural conditions, but we're not talking about in the same way maybe. So grassroots actors in Detroit were calling this out in the top. What you see there is Meadowlark was a corporation, a public benefit corporation that partnered with the Clinton Global Initiative in the middle of the 2000s. I think it was 2016. And they were going to go into Detroit and pay primarily African-American mothers. They said this explicitly, African-American mothers. They wanted to recruit 2,000 of them, pay them for their breast milk or human milk, pasteurize it, and use it in NICUs outside of the city. Because we don't have a federal system to regulate first foods, unlike the other food system. So you can't access human milk in a NICU, even in hospitals, without some kind of informal, not federally regulated process for acquiring that milk. And so this corporation was partnering with the Clinton initiative to try to come in and fill that need. But spatially, it raised a lot of issues that are really critical to environmental justice, because essentially they were taking a known kind of low income, vulnerable African-American population, offering financial incentive, primarily to then take that human milk into the suburbs that we know are primarily white racialized in that area, mostly richer, and you have to have good health insurance typically to access those NICUs. And those would be the clients for the milk. So it was a very racialized food systems issue, and a local group called the Black Mothers Breastfeeding Association called it out. It made national news, and eventually they kind of withdrew. And this is while I was just working there. It was fascinating to me, concerning to me. I was also pregnant, and I hadn't even thought about this stuff, so kind of highlighted my own lack of intersectional lens on some of these issues. And then Detroit food security policy. So food systems actors there were talking about these a little bit. There's actually a line in the Detroit food security policy about first foods. And then it's just important to know that, again, because of historical and cultural factors that are not individualized, that are rooted in systemic racism, these issues matter because they are disproportionately affecting communities of color, and over time are contributing things to the fact that, like, the United States has the highest maternal and infant mortality rates in the world for rich countries. And basically it's women of color, disproportionately Black women and children, who are carrying that statistic, because they're about 4 times more likely to die than white women and children in the first year of life. And then also there are corresponding food security issues that map onto that. So it was out of this kind of understanding that, whoa, food is not, in this case, just a racialized issue. It's very much a racialized issue that's intersecting with gender. And unfortunately, the quote looks like it got out of the box, but that's Dalvery's quote. I remember the first time I interviewed her, because I was starting to wonder more about what were these patterns across the United States. So I contacted her in Milwaukee, because her organization is a nationally known organization. And she told me what's normal is to see babies dying in our community. And that was not normal in my community. I mean, it happened, but it wasn't normal. And I understood that was a racialized white privilege I have, also a class privilege, also a spatial privilege. And so I was curious about these intersections and what we could address about them. And we were seeing them kind of everywhere, this pattern of addressing gender and environmental justice and addressing race and environmental justice, but not necessarily addressing what unique needs are emerging from the intersection. So at the same time I was in Detroit with this Metal Act issue around 2016, the Flint water crisis was breaking, right? And we heard a lot about how this was about really dangerous for young babies and infants who will develop really bad neurological and lifetime impacts from exposure to lead. And it was in the water, so it was much, much more dangerous for infants who were consuming powdered formulas that were reconstituted with the local water supply. So if you already had an underlying food security issue, you were going to probably have that exacerbated by water issues. And that kind of food security water issue is going to disproportionately affect the Black community. So Dalvery and I became really good friends as these things were happening, just kind of talking about it. And then Milwaukee had its own lead crisis break in 2018. So in Milwaukee, what happened is in January 2018, then Mayor Tom Barrett, who has since left office, disclosed that the city failed to notify about 8,000 predominantly Black families that their children had tested positive for elevated lead levels in their blood. People affected were disproportionately located in the northern city center zip codes, the 53206, 53208, and 53210 zip codes. You can see that in the map, hopefully a little bit on the below area. What you see there is a redlining map from when racialized segregation was legal in the United States, and redlined areas would get the least amount of money and assistance and development in their infrastructure. Those redlined areas correspond to what we would consider Black racialized populations. It was an explicitly racist policy that identified Negro areas as not meriting certain funds and having detrimental influences because of their Negro population. over time, that region, you can see the green in the second, it stayed predominantly African-American for a variety of reasons I'll talk about. And today you see that also corresponds in those red colors to the highest concentrations of lead poisoning in babies. So there's kind of a historical correlation rooted in racialized segregation that many of us, many policymakers, many people before me have long talked about. And Dalby and I were just speaking on the shoulders of those folks who have already started talking about these patterns. But again, in Milwaukee, those patterns weren't being correlated with the city's response in terms of its messaging. They were targeting residential housing, but they were only speaking in gendered terms. And it wasn't really addressing some of the issues we were starting to get concerned about. So we decided to do our own research. And our research, it was 2 phases. Our first phase, we just went to the community and did a variety of surveys and community conversations and just learned about what were predominantly members of these zip codes experiencing. And we noticed there were disproportionately representation from people who gender identify as women or mothers or parents in that space. And they had a lot of concerns we hadn't heard about in other places, and things like landlord intimidation, historical trauma, lack of trust, knowing what to believe, school systems not being clear, doctors not even mentioning lead, not clarifying when to do boil water advisories, which is not safe in a lead situation. It concentrates the lead. So there's just a lack of information or support from like trusted professionals, but there was high concern. And it seemed rooted in the zip codes. If you went to other areas like the suburbs, they were getting higher counseling in lead. It was actually normal for children to be tested for lead every 4 or 6 months and then at a year old. So there's just geographic disparities, and they seem to map onto race and gender. So we wanted to understand how this emerged. And we did a historical study similar to the redlining patterns I just explained, except we wanted to put gender in there as well. And we really kind of emphasized in our paper that when Milwaukee was founded, like many cities, not only was there racialized segregation, but intermixed with that was gender differences too. Women, period, couldn't own property, but women of color, because of the intersection of racism and sexism, tended to work outside of the home more. And they were kind of degraded as mothers for leaving their home to work, but kind of celebrated as caregivers to other children. And over time, it kind of became this dynamic where white men own the majority of housing and Black women kind of maintain them. And those are kind of the polar ends of this kind of racialized segregation and how it mapped onto gender in different ways. And throughout time, this has been amplified. So women couldn't even have credit until the 1970s. We were addressing kind of race and gender separately in a lot of social movements in the mid-60s. So even when the Civil Rights Act comes out, women with children or families with children are not a protected class. When the Equal Housing Act comes out, again, women couldn't have credit until later. And so this intersects with racism. And even today now, so getting into more recent dynamics, what's happened is women with children were getting a lot of landlord intimidation that was disproportionately against Black women as their partners were being extracted from the space as part of the war on drugs. So this is a flip side of the incarceration crisis, which is mostly a Black male crisis. And you can see this at the bottom, kind of the red bar is Black men incarceration in Wisconsin. And the blue bar in the first thing is Black male incarceration nationally. So it's double in Wisconsin, and it's already super high nationally. And the flip side of this is women of color being left in places that are now getting flooded with you have vacancies. So you have new businesses, multinational corporations coming in, low wage jobs, fast food restaurants, that kind of stuff, not offering nursing support, family leave policies. And then this kind of landlord intimidation that's still allowed. Today, in high poverty white areas of Milwaukee, 1 in 150 white women are evicted in these high poverty white areas. But in high poverty Black areas, 1 in 17 Black women are. And so the rates of things like for housing and landlord intimidation and trying to remediate lead issues and stuff really intersects with those issues. So we, in our article, clarify these dynamics, and we term these kind of dynamics and how they intersect, spatialized intersectionality. And so what we're hoping with this idea is that folks still forefront race, but as we start to get more about like what policies are going to fix these problems, what are the root structures we have to amplify, how do we justify housing when we talk about these things, how do we justify bias in healthcare when we're asking for federal dollars or arguing for X, Y, and Z. We hope this concept can kind of get us into those spaces that maybe we haven't been able to. So I'll just conclude here that hopefully, if this makes sense, and you can read the article, but theoretically, we're kind of getting at this past tense connotation that we should assume inequality, Western forms or colonial forms or hegemonic forms of inequality exists in the spaces we're working already, just like we might think racism's embedded in space. It probably intersects with other forms. I mean, you can think of bathroom debates today, heteronormativity and sexuality could be spatialized, right? And then methodologically, it demands us just to study this and think about how we can dismantle it in our law and policy. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Morrell. Excellent presentation. We're going to round out all of these fantastic presentations with a great presentation from Dr. Lengefeld. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you to my prior presenters, and thank you very much for that introduction. I'm presenting today on some research that I co-authored with Gregory Hooks, who's up at McMaster University in Canada. And the title of our presentation was Callous Cruelty and Blowback. And we were focused on ICE facilities, riskscapes, and community transmission of COVID-19. And so we began this from a critical environmental justice perspective. And in this work, David Pello, who's also a presenter in the symposium, he emphasizes that critical environmental justice should emphasize structured inequality, state policy, and intersectionality, and that we need to examine environmental justice at multiple scales. Especially, there's a need to focus on carceral institutions, as some of my other panel members have focused on, but also immigrant prisons as well. And so in the spring and the summer of 2020, there's heightened transmission of COVID-19 in immigration and customs enforcement facilities. And so our purpose here was really twofold. It was to examine first what happened in the spring, and then what happened in the summer as well as the pandemic took full effect. And so as we focused on this heightened transmission of COVID-19 in nearby counties and communities, we look at these as two different riskscapes. And I'll explain the riskscapes idea here in just a moment, but essentially what we have here is the idea, a very famous idea in sociology, of unanticipated and intended consequences. And so it was true that the policymakers and ICE officials didn't understand the emergence and spread of COVID-19. It was a novel virus. But in this sense, the role played by these ICE facilities was not intended. On the other hand, it was fully anticipated. Long before COVID-19 pandemic, it had been thoroughly documented that ICE facilities are unhealthy and inhumane for the people detained in them, and that these facilities facilitate the spread of disease. And so in this sense, the role played by these ICE facilities did not arise out of ignorance. Despite their knowledge of the risks, ICE officials and US policymakers as well were willing to expose detainees and employees as well in ICE facilities, as well as those living in nearby communities, to a heightened risk of COVID-19 infection. And so we drew lessons from the Black Lives Matter movement and critical race theory to kind of contextualize our research. One of the important ideas here is that we do not live in a colorblind society. And since the civil rights reforms of the 60s and 70s, the policies and procedures of police departments and corrections bureaucracies have been rendered colorblind. But this doesn't really capture the complex changing historical context or meaning of racial identity in the United States politics and society. And just as policing is intentionally designed to harm Black bodies and Black lives in this context, this harsh and racist criminal justice system was designed to disenfranchise, stigmatize, and intimidate Black people. And so the Black Lives Matter movement has documented and condemned this, and referencing it as a war on Black people, which has served, quote, a cocktail of racialized surveillance, policing, and incarceration that plagues Black communities. In other words, these harsh outcomes were intended and anticipated. Elected officials at all levels of government openly supported lynching. Police often either ignored what was going on or actively participated in such activities. And in the US, the Senate, the filibuster was used to prevent passage of anti-lynching legislation specifically. And so after 9/11, this racialized, criminalized justice system and its policies were infused into the US immigration enforcement first policies. And although these policies were largely focused on immigrants coming from Mexico and Central America, the deleterious consequences of this racist over-policing also inflict a lot of harm on Black Americans and Black immigrants as well. And so it can be debated whether or not this criminalization of immigration was intended to degrade and dehumanize Black and brown immigrants to the United States. But even if these intent of these policy choices can be debated, the consequences were fully documented and anticipated long before the COVID-19 pandemic. And so just some brief statistics to get a sense of the disproportionate impact of the inhumane conditions and treatment of people who are Black within immigration facilities. 20% of those facing deportation are Black, while Black non-citizens account for only 7% of the non-citizen population. 76% of Black immigrants were removed on criminal grounds rather than immigration violations, whereas 45% of immigrants overall were deported on criminal grounds. And finally, it's worth noting here that solitary confinement, which violates international law, was widely used at ICE facilities and used disproportionately against Black immigrants. African and Caribbean ICE detainees represent 3.64% of all ICE immigrant detainees, but were involved in nearly a quarter of solitary confinement cases. And so we drew from this literature of riskscapes to understand what was going on both within ICE facilities and also how that spread to the surrounding communities. And the basics of riskscapes is that defining and responding to one set of perceived risks, COVID-19, or rather immigration policy, exacerbates other risks like the spread of COVID-19. And so the rationale for this is that a punitive approach lowers the risk of criminal predation in the larger society. And there's little evidence that these measures actually dampen crime. And there's actually substantive evidence that these policies degrade democratic institutions in general and civil rights more broadly. And the criminalization of immigration is defended on similar grounds. In terms of the actual risks confronting people detained by ICE, there are numerous, but violations of civil and human rights, and including being denied adequate access to health facilities and treatment, ICE failing to provide suitable mental health services or completely unavailable, ICE impeding access to legal counsel, abusive treatment, including women being subject to sexual assault, forced sterilization, people with disabilities subjected to cruel and inhumane treatment and neglect, and wage theft. Wage theft is also widespread. And finally, overcrowding and inadequacy of these facilities is well documented. According to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, children were forced to sleep on the floor in overcrowded facilities without access to adequate health care or food, with poor sanitation conditions. Food quality has been routinely poor and too often unsafe. There's also a sharp increase in the number of people detained, exacerbating overcrowding and understaffing as well. And really, I think this quote sums up a lot of it. One detainee said that burials are cheaper than deportations. This really captures kind of the callous bureaucratic disregard and inhumane conditions within ICE facilities. So our research design was, we used a logistic regression on the front end on the first riskscape, and then what's known as a Poisson regression, a generalized two-stage least square estimation. And we built on some prior work which had identified a subset of variables which were most responsible for the spread of within the community. And so here we have a set of COVID milestones. The COVID milestones are not listed here, but the first milestone was at least one case as of April 1st. And then the next presence was more than one case as of May 1st. And then we went up from there in intervals. So more than 15 cases, more than 100 cases, more than 250 cases. And then a major outbreak was more than 2,500 cases. And we looked at two different levels. We looked at the county level and then what's known as the BEA level. And the BEA is the Multi-County Bureau of Economic Analysis area. So this kind of captures when people work in one county and live in another and how that would spread an infectious disease throughout a community. We used open source data from ICE detainee data and the New York Times, which had compiled a substantial amount of COVID data. And so here are our two riskscapes, right? The first was the callous cruelty within ICE detention centers. And we kind of just described some of what was going on in there, which was disproportionately harming Black lives and Black bodies. And then also the second riskscape, which is we use the idea of blowback to explain how these harsh conditions imposed in this cruel and inhumane way had consequences for the community. They spread throughout the community as well. And so looking at our first riskscape, we asked this question: did ICE detention facilities bring COVID-19 sooner and more severely? Here we have the RUCA, which is known as the Rural Urban Commuting Area. And basically the way this works was there was a reference, the county was the reference, and then all of these other RUCAs are tethered to the reference point. And so, for example, you can see here with what I've highlighted, the odds of a ratio for a RUCA town having more than one case confirmed relative to a county was 3.415, which is 341.5% more likely to have at least one case confirmed as of April 1st. And in broad terms, our control variables and they performed as anticipated. The Black population was positive and statistically significant in terms of its explanation for the spread. And also we noticed that there was a pretty large impact across all of these areas. So you can see that they're all statistically significant for all of these different milestones. And in the micropolitan area, similar impacts, but of a larger magnitude. And then when we move to the metro area, we can see again that the impact of having an ICE facility, depending on the number of people within that ICE facility, increased the likelihood and the scale of the spread of COVID-19 during this time period. And so, counties in a metro area, compared with rural counties, more than 100 times more likely to experience severe outbreaks. And so these are kind of scenarios which explain kind of the comparison points. I'll skip through some of these, but we would expect that if there was a 0 or 1% detained in an average county, there would be a 69.2% chance to have confirmed at least one case by April 1st. And similarly, the likelihood goes up if more than one person in the county was detained. So in this example, up to 83.5%. So returning to our question, the answer is yes. ICE prisons elevated the risk of COVID-19 events. When compared with a county with 1 or 0 persons, a county with 2 or more people detained was 129.3% more likely to have at least one case confirmed by April 1st. The number of detainees increased likelihood of at least one confirmed case by April 1st, and higher levels of ICE detention increased likelihood in the BEA area as well. And so if BEA areas with 26 or more ICE detainees face an even greater elevated risk of COVID-19 milestones. And so to our second riskscape, the blowback. I'll explain the term blowback in a moment, but we used this Poisson regression to understand this. And this is basically a spatial model to understand how these conditions facilitate the spread outside of the walls of ICE facilities. And so what you're looking here is the results of our spatially weighted regression analysis. And we restricted to 48 states. But basically what we found was the growth of COVID-19 from May 1st to August 1st as a definitive variable demonstrated that, yes, indeed, this facilitated the spread into the surrounding areas depending on the number of people detained in these ICE prisons. And so if we just focus on ICE and detention in the county, the COVID-19 caseload increases as the number of people detained by ICE increases. And so I want to move forward just to our final point here, just the conclusions. The conclusions at two scales about this. Within these prisons, racist over-policing and mass incarceration policies were put in place intentionally to intimidate and stigmatize Black Americans. Mass incarceration itself was not designed to facilitate disease transmission, but it was well documented and anticipated that this was going to happen before COVID-19. The question isn't why ICE officials and U.S. political leaders failed to anticipate these effects, but why, given the foreseen risks, why they chose to go ahead anyway. And coming to our second riskscape within the surrounding communities, ICE facilities are part of a riskscape of surrounding communities and counties. And we use the term blowback to explain this. Blowback originates from chemical weapons and biological weapons use in the World Wars, World War I and World War II, where you use chemical weapons, the wind may shift and it may blow back on your own troops. And the fact is that it was known, military leaders knew this, and they would accept those risks and still use those weapons anyway, fully anticipating the unwelcome consequences. And so finally, this was to draw a conclusion, the callous cruelty within these ICE facilities and their procedures and policies and the human and social and political rights of people seeking to immigrate in the United States were routinely violated. And this same callousness led to ICE to persist in detention policies that gave rise to alarmingly high infection COVID-19 rates in ICE facilities and in surrounding counties.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lengefeld. We have had such a treat, and I have a few questions for you, but I think that in order to save time, I'd ask you to keep your answers, very succinct and focused, because we have a number of questions. That was fantastic. And I love the way the presentations are so interconnected. So first question is for Dr. Dixon. In regard to anti-Black racism within the criminal legal system in the United States, incarcerated persons tend to be overlooked as a vulnerable group, and we all know that. This was further magnified during the COVID-19 pandemic and rapid spread in prison cells. Could you speak about prison abolition as disaster mitigation in the era of climate change and related disasters, or speak a little bit more about that?
Yes, and I think just kind of tying it back into COVID-19, we saw extreme disparities in COVID treatment, vaccinations, and the access, both in the community, but as well as among incarcerated populations. And I think when we're talking about incarcerated populations and COVID, it helped to actually fuel the pandemic or the spread of this pandemic, as we've heard, and that includes because of prison transfers, poor ventilation, overcrowding of facilities, et cetera. So I think when we're talking abolition, we see a huge need for looking at extreme heat, COVID-19, and the impacts of disasters. I think we can think of it several different ways. One, really understanding the root cause of why we see the number of incarcerated individuals and how communities play a role in that. And other strategies include reducing the size and scope of prisons and such facilities, as well as investing in communities and investing in community-based resources as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dixon. Excellent. Appreciate that. Dr. Lengefeld, since your presentation is so fresh on our minds, we're still very much in the COVID era, as we've heard before, we all know. Could you speak on enforcement facilities as a riskscape for viral transmission?
Certainly. Well, I guess kind of for what comes to mind is all these new variants, which keep emerging constantly. And I'm not out of line to say that these spaces operate as petri dishes for the emergence of new variants as well, not only in terms of the inadequate access to vaccines and other preventative measures, just like masks and basic sanitation, but then also due to the overcrowding, the understaffing, and then of course there's the issue of how these things actually are spread between ICE facilities as well. When inmates are, their solitary confinement is used. Also, inmates are often shipped to different facilities, and this just creates this breeding ground, which spatially is quite wide.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, that's my just initial thoughts on that.
Well, building off of that, can you speak a little bit about psychosocial stressors that are associated with enforcement presence in communities?
Yeah, I
So
mean,
let me add to that, and psychosocial stressors that are we don't talk about in the prisons.
yeah, I mean, I think one psychosocial stressor that comes to mind is the fact that a lot of migrant communities at the beginning of the pandemic, when vaccines started becoming available, were very hesitant to get vaccinated, right? For a good reason, for a good historical reason, and compounding on top of the access issues to vaccines as well in those communities. You can see how at an individual level and even at a community level, that produces a certain amount of stress. If you want the vaccine, it wasn't even available in your community, perhaps, if you were already past all of the historical issues with the medical neglect and other distasteful things that happened prior regarding vaccine distribution and so forth.
Thank you. Thank you so much for answering that. Dr. Alvarez, while we've been ramping up discussion on police brutality and toxic prisons, there's less discourse on the military as a potentially significant contributor to environmental injustice. Could you speak more on this topic?
Yes. So I think sometimes we forget how embedded the military is in our everyday lives. Right now, I'm in San Diego, and during my presentation, I was hearing like space or these planes that they're driving around or flying around, and I think part of it is because like sometimes the military can get like a pass. They definitely do get a pass in certain environmental regulations. There's not as much reporting done, but I do just want to, I hope through the presentation and through the other presentations, we can sort of see how important it is to recognize the military and its implications for environmental justice issues, that they do contribute a lot to the air pollution, water pollution, um, and if we can draw attention to it, I hope we can have some more accountability towards the Department of Defense. Like I had mentioned, they're one of two of the only agency who has not updated their environmental justice strategic plan since 94. And in some regards, I'm like, okay, well, do we really just want them to update like a piece of paper? But I do think it is important to at least have that conversation of environmental justice with the military.
Exactly. I totally agree with you. And Dr. Morrell, the role of social work has emerged in EJA discourse. How can social workers engage with Black communities to promote environmental justice and fight against systemic environmental racism?
Thank you. I think it's about, well, I feel like individual social workers and maybe the profession, that's not my specialty, but my guess is as individuals and even as a profession, probably resource strapped. So I would say it would be about political and public will to provide the conditions for social workers to do more work. But I know that in terms of the communities I've been involved in, they're often the next step in the frontline community to access resources. So they're kind of almost that they serve to function as the intermediary between the community and where the kind of more privileged resources can be accessed, whether that's through, insurance policies, federal or private. whether that's through access to facilities, access to resources. So I think we should see social workers and community health workers as a resource that we could amplify, that often have some trust in the community if they're, following often what we would hope they were doing. They have some established trust. They're usually from the community. Paying them means money stays in the community. Know-how that they have should be valued as expertise, and so it should be compensated as expertise. And then they tend to be just like a good access point, I would say, for those reasons, and have both knowledge of the community and of outside resources that can be really valuable in environmental justice work and can maybe get at some of those health disparities.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And this question is for anyone, from the audience. So please, the audience participant would like to know, and we'd all like to know, your thoughts on how you address a lack of healthy food question and good medical maternal care for these families. And we talk about lack of healthy food. That's in and outside, I think, of the prison system. Anybody?
I can talk again and start. I would say it gets at root causes. The healthy food question is rooted in power imbalances, and we do see this in the prison system, and we see it in communities. Wherever there are communities who aren't in society recognized as, in a sense, automatically deserving healthy fresh food, for example, then we're going to see them not receive that. And so we know there are patterns to who is oppressed and not given access to resources, who's marginalized, whether it's the prison system, the school system, the healthcare system. We can anticipate these patterns. And I would argue it's our responsibility, since we know that, to start addressing them proactively, not so much reactively, like, oh, we need to get food or we need to do this, but proactively, no, we're going to see disparities. How can we make sure we're designing laws and policies that create equitable redistribution of resources that compensate for those disparities?
Thank you. And Dr. Lengefeld, I see you've unmuted. Did you want to add?
I mean, thinking about access to healthy food in as we said, in a petri dish of an immigrant prison, which they call them detention facilities, but they're prisons. Yeah, I mean, if you just think about the biology of the healthy body, right? Fighting off infection requires healthy food. At the very foundation of life, we all need healthy food. And so understanding these disparities as they exist out in the community already, and then thinking about how those disparities are even more exacerbated within these highly hidden, I mean, they're often called states within states, these facilities. Solitary confinement is a state within a state within a state. And thinking about access to healthy food in these conditions and how we can get healthy food to people is a really important question, I think.
Yeah. And I should have added with that the issues around water that we heard about, even access to water and ice and access to clean water and ice. So those are some concerns. So we have 2 minutes left, and I'm wondering if you guys could give us some quick last words, and so that we can, have something for the audience to really take home and act on. And okay.
I can go ahead and start.
Yes.
Just kind of talking about my work, looking at extreme heat in prisons, and just trying to really get the issue out there. And while, we talk about Texas and the 13 states that may not have air condition, we're learning that this issue is a lot more widespread than what we thought. And as we continue to see increases in the spread of infectious disease, and we're dealing with a population where we see increased chronic disease, it's very important that we address some of these issues, such as air quality, water quality, access to healthy food. So I think it's very important that we look at this from an interdisciplinary lens. I think we all come with different backgrounds, even here on this panel, and that's needed to get in and address these issues.
Thank you, Dr. Dixon. Dr. Morrell, I see you. Are you unmuted?
Oh, I was unmuted already. But
okay.
It's been a wonderful panel. And yeah, I think I see connections between all the things we're talking about. And I think that as environmental justice and climate justice continues to get exacerbated injustice by changing conditions, we're going to see more and more of unexpected but important intersections that we need to pay attention to. I was recently hearing about Texas prisons that are involved in like confined animal feeding operations to produce food for the public, right? So there's an intersection. I've been thinking about wildland firefighters who are incarcerated and they're not paid, and then they're in the public if they get out of their sentence. And they've done their time, but they can't actually get a job because they have a felony conviction on their record. So you're getting kind of class intersections with racialized intersections that will just continue to be a form of exploitation. So, I looked at maybe in the communities that some of these members leave behind, but I think that thinking in not new ways folks are already thinking in the community, but amplifying that in policy and law and public health is an exciting and essential next step if we want to keep up with the problems that we're facing.
Thank you, Dr. Morrell. Dr. Lengefeld, I see you unmuted.
I think one really big takeaway here is we should end enforcement first and try to think of more humane ways to enforce immigration policies. It's very clear that these are failed policies, and most of the people detained in these facilities are not criminals. And so we continue along this path, and it produces blowback, just like it did in chemical weapons and biological weapons use in world wars. We see the very similar dynamics occurring within these ICE facilities, also, as Benika was saying, within the prisons as well.
Thank you, Dr. Lengefeld. Very succinct. And Dr. Alvarez.
I think it's just important. One thing that really stuck with me was Dr. Dixon's idea of abolition, and I think reimagining that we don't have to keep doing what we're doing, we can be creative, and I think abolition is definitely I thank you, Dr. Dixon, for bringing that up. I think we should take that away too to address some of these environmental injustice issues.
Thank you. And I would like to take a moment to thank this wonderful panel. I have learned so much today and actually ran out of paper and started writing on the back of my bills, which could be a good thing. But thank you. And thank you to the audience for participating in this and other sessions in the symposium today. Please enjoy.